My mom is here for a couple of months and I'm really excited about that because this time around she's interested in sewing and she wasn't on her last visit. So she's asked me for a beginner-friendly quilt that we can work on together, and of course I'm going to answer the mail on that. Hey friends, welcome back to my sewing room. My name is Becca, and in today's video we've got a tutorial for you for the quilt that you see hanging up behind me. I am really excited about this because I feel like this is a beginner-friendly pattern. My mom's working on it independently, and there is an actual pattern to accompany this tutorial video. If you are a member of my VIP program over on my website, sewbecca.com, then you get access to this pattern for free. That's $5 a month, $55 a year. So if you haven't signed up, all the details for how to do that will be in the description box down below. If you are not a member of the VIP program though, this pattern is available for sale on my Etsy shop, and a link to that will be down there as well. In today's video, we're going to go through step by step how to put this quilt together. It's a relatively easy sew. It does take a little bit more time than some of the patterns that I've made in the past. So grab some fabric, grab some time on your calendar, and let's get to work making the Dancing Squares quilt. Let's talk really quick about the fabric that we pulled for this. My mom is going to make this quilt. She wanted to use this really pretty, I think it's winter paper grunge. And then these two cuts of fabric that she's been hoarding in her drawers, they were on my shelves and then they disappeared. And then she grabbed one more fabric from my shelf to put this quilt together. I actually think this color combination is beautiful. And it's actually the coloring that I originally had in mind for the quilt top. So I think this is going to work out nicely. But I want to make one too, and I want to see what it'll look like with a black background. So I'm going to set this aside, and let me show you the fabrics that I pulled for this. I've got this washed black from Moda Bella Solids, and then the three prints that I'm bringing into this were also from my stash. I believe two of them might be a Lori Holt. This blue and this pink are Lori Holt fabrics. And this is an older fig tree fabric that I think was left over from one of the block of the months that I did with the Ella and Ollie line, I think. Don't quote me. This is the one that I'm going to put together, and these are the fabrics that I'm going to use for my tutorial, but you'll want to stick around to the end because I'd love to show you what my mom's quilt and my quilt look like, and I'd be interested to hear which one you like more. Now that we've picked out our fabric and shown you our pull, it's time to get to pressing our yardage so that we can do our cutting. And I want to let you know in the description box down below, the pattern that I have for you does have enough room in the fabric requirements to starch all of your yardage if that's your thing. And it of course assumes that you're working with fabric that is 40 inches wide. All right, let's kick this into high speed mode. And when I mean high speed mode, I mean boom, instantly my fabric is pressed. Don't you wish you could iron all of your yardage this quick? I know I do. I don't have a trick for you with quick pressing, but I do have a trick to make for some quick cutting. Let me show you what I do when I need to cut lots of strips of fabric without an AccuQuilt a little bit quicker. So the first thing that I want to do is fold my fabric in fours. So I'm going to fold it once like it comes on the bolt and then one more time. And when I do that, I want to make sure that my selvage edges are lined up, and then I'm going to take the fold and match that up there. And I want to make sure that my fabric is laying nice and flat. There's no twist, there's no turns, there's no curves, nothing wonky. It's nice and flat and smooth. Then I'm going to turn this around. Be a little careful here. You don't want to mess it up. I'm going to come in with a ruler. I'm going to line my ruler up on this bottom fold. Remember, the selvage and other fold are up at the top. The bottom fold is towards me. I'm going to put one of the lines of my ruler on that bottom fold. I'm going to push the ruler all the way over until it's kind of up against the edge. I want to use my rotary cutter to clean this off, and I want to make sure that I go through all 4 layers of that fabric. So I'll kind of do one of these things to make sure that I'm going to get through all 4 layers of that fabric. When I do, I'm making very careful attention, or paying very careful attention to this line on this bottom fold. I want to make sure that this entire fold of the fabric stays on a line on my ruler so it's nice and straight. Then I'm going to get a rotary cutter. I'm going to clean this up. Now I have a perfectly straight edge here. And this is a perfect 90-degree to the fold that's at the bottom. So if I pick this up very carefully and turn it over, now I can cut my strips measuring from this edge. I don't need a special ruler. I don't need a special cutting tool. I just need to do a little bit of math. My ruler is 8.5 inches wide. I am cutting 1.5-inch strips. So I do have to do a little bit of math to figure out how many strips I can get from this ruler. I know that for 1.5-inch strips, 1.5 inches times 5 is going to take me to 7.5 inches. So I know I can get 5 strips cut at 1.5 inches from this ruler. So I'm going to slide over the 7.5-inch mark on that fresh cut edge that I just made. And then down here at the bottom on the fold, I'm also going to make sure that that fold is on that straight line on my ruler. Now I want to point this out to you. When I cleaned up the edge here, because this piece of fabric came off and it was continuous all the way through, that's how I have confidence that this whole piece is nice and clean and there's no wonkiness in any of the layers. There's no elbow waiting for me on the other side. I've got a perfect 90-degree here, so I'm going to cut through here. I'll move this out of the way, and now I'm just going to keep moving the ruler over 1.5 inches, and every time I do, that new measurement's going to be on that one cut line. So 7.5 minus 1.5 is 6. There's 1.5 inches. 6 minus 1.5 is 4.5. Here is another strip. 4.5 minus 1.5 is 3 inches. Every time I do this, I am making sure that my new measurement is on that clean edge and the line on the bottom is on that bottom fold. The last one that I've got is right at 1.5 inches. So in no time at all, I've got 5 strips that each measure 1.5 inches by width of fabric. I just want to show you, because the proof is in the pudding, I don't have any wonkiness on this strip. It is perfectly straight. Take a look at this. This is the part where you're probably curious. In the middle of the fabric, is that still straight? Yep, it sure is. It lines up on my rotary mat. So give it a try. All of my strips are now cut, and now I get to subcut everything down. I'm going to go back to the pattern, check for how many I need from each size, and get everything cut so that I can get to sewing. As I'm laying out my strips to subcut them, I want to let you know that the pattern I gave you is extremely generous with your cutting instructions, meaning that you're gonna have some leftovers. If you are the type of person that wants to maximize the efficiency of your cutting and make sure that you are prioritizing keeping every last little bit of some fabric, then I would recommend maybe spend some time recalculating my cutting instructions. But one of the ways that you can do that easily is just by cutting the largest strips first. And then before you start diving into subcutting the smaller pieces that you need, you can go to the scraps that were left over from those larger cuts and see if you can source any of your smaller bits from those leftover areas. That's a great way to help minimize some of your waste and get that extra fabric into your quilt. And if you do that, you might not need as much fabric as the pattern said. Probably just a couple inches less, but you know, every little bit counts, right? Okay, so this is my last cut for this fabric, and I should be able to sew pretty quickly. So this is all of the fabric that I have subcut, and I am ready to sew together to make my blocks. This is my background. This is fabric 1, this is fabric 2, and this is fabric 3. And of course, my colors coordinate with the images in my printed pattern, which makes sense to me, but you might be working with a different colorway. And so for that reason, in the pattern, there are some coloring pages that you can use to color the quilt, block 1 and block 2 based on the fabric colors that you have pulled. I am a visual learner, and it works better for me when I can see a color layout of what the block is going to look like as I'm building it out, rather than just reading somebody's instructions. So hopefully those coloring pages will help you customize this quilt to be what you want it to be. And once it's done, don't forget to post on social media and tag me in it. I'd love to see your finished quilt. Okay, let's start by building out block number 1. I'm going to tell you the secret here. Block number 1 starts with your background fabric and ends with your background fabric. We're only going to bring in fabric 1 and 2 as our color. And block number 2 is going to start with fabric 1 and end with fabric 3. And we're going to bring in background in between fabric 1 and 2, and then in between fabric 2 and 3. You probably already know how to do this, but let me show you how, just in case maybe you don't. So I'm going to take my small square of my background fabric, and then from fabric 1, I need 2 small squares, and I'm going to put them on either side of that center square, and I'm going to sew 1/4 inch. Now, here's the trick. If I sew 1/4 inch on this side and 1/4 inch on this side, I have taken away 1/2 inch from this square. So I can use this very step to measure and make sure that I have an absolute accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. If this square is too big, it's wider than what it should be after I take that 1/2 inch away, guess what? That means my seam allowance is too small. And if this square is too small, it means that my seam allowance is too big. So you can adjust your seam allowance based on your findings. But it's a great step when you start this quilt off, just to check your seam allowance and make sure that you're spot on. So here we go. I'm going to start off by lining up the fabric and taking 1/4 inch on one side of that background square, and then taking the other piece of fabric 1, lining it up with the opposite side, and taking another 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once you've sewn those 2 little pieces onto either side of that background square, we're going to press the seams away from that center square. Then we're going to come in with a little ruler, and I just want to measure this to make sure that that center square is exactly 1/2 inch smaller than what I cut it at. If it is, then my seam allowance is spot on and I'm good to go, and it looks like my 1/4 inch is absolutely perfect, so I'm really excited about that. The next step is to finish building this out. So we're going to grab our fabric 1B, and we're going to put them on the top and the bottom of this little unit so that we're kind of building out a border around that center square. And the size, the width of this should be the same width of this. If we're sewing everything with a true 1/4 inch, everything should just magically match up. If you are somebody who likes to pin your pieces as you go, this is absolutely a wonderful time to do that. I'm not a big pinner when it comes to small pieces like this because I feel like I can keep control of the fabric by just holding onto it. And so for me, I just wing it. But if you like to pin to get a more precise results, please feel free to do that. This would probably help you. I guess I'm just glutton for punishment. Once I have my top and bottom pieces sewn on, I'm going to finger press those rows out away from the center, and then I'll come in with a hot iron and get that to lay really nice and flat. And then my next step is going to be to reference the pattern for the size that this should square up to. Now, if I'm finding that the cut pieces are matching the previously pieced areas perfectly, I probably could skip this step, but you're going to get the best results if you stop and press every time you add another round of color or background and then square it up. I sewed this one a little bit funny. The seam allowance here and here is a little smaller than what it should be, and you can tell because this row is wider than these 2 rows. So this definitely needs some squaring up. And I want to show you some tricks that I use to keep this square straight and in the center. First thing I do is grab a square ruler and I look for the 45-degree line, and I line that up on the center square. I make sure that it goes through one corner and then the other. And then I'm just going to make sure that I've got about the same amount of fabric on the left and the right, and then the top and the bottom. I want to make sure that this square is evenly placed. And so what I'm doing is kind of just trying to find a spot where I have got the same amount of fabric around all four sides. And there's fabric either coming to or pushing past the edge of the ruler, and then the lines where I want to square it up. Because if I did all of that and the fabric was too shy, it wasn't coming to the edge of the ruler or the lines where I need to square up, then I'm not going to get the block the size I need it to be. So I'm making sure that it's at least measuring up to what it should be. This square is straight because the 45-degree line is going through both corners of the block. And I've got about the same amount of distance all the way around the second fabric between where the edge of the black is and where the edge of the ruler or the marking is going to be. And then once it looks like that's the case for me, I'm going to come in and I'll clean up the right, clean up the top. Then I'll turn this around 90 degrees, 180 degrees, sorry. And I'm going to put those freshly cut lines on the lines where I'm going to square up to. And at this point, my 45-degree line should go directly through the corners of that block. It looks like it does. I am going to just double check that same distance measurement that I did before. And if everything looks good, then I'll clean up the right and then the top again. And now I have a perfectly cleaned up block that is going to be ready for my next round. And it's important that I'm doing that because sometimes, even though our cutting is absolutely precise, and even though we think our 1/4 inch is spot on or we're sewing perfectly straight, sometimes we're not. And if we just take that moment to press, to get the block nice and flat and press it, and then square it up, you're going to remove this excess fabric. This wasn't a ton, and I probably could have left it in there and been okay, but if I keep having this across every single seam in all of my blocks, it's going to add wonkiness and other things that I got to deal with when it's time to put all the blocks together. So this little bit of extra work now will save you a headache later, especially when you're putting those blocks together. And then we're going to pull our fabric 2, number 2, so like 2B or whatever it's called in the pattern, put it on the left and the right, and then fabric 2C or 2-3, whatever it's called in the pattern, is going to go on the top and bottom. Those will be sewn together with a 1/4 inch. And remember, I said that block number 1 is going to start and end with your background fabric. The last 2 strips, this is going to be background 4 and 5. Background 4 is going to go on the left and the right, and background 5 is going to go on the top and the bottom. And so we're just working from the center outwards to build out this block. So I'm going to get to work sewing this. Let's see how it squares up when it's all done. Just finger pressing when I add the sides, and then I'm going to grab the top and the bottom. I've added a full round of background, so now it's time to stop and hit this with my iron. And then I want to take a moment to square this up. Again, the dimensions for what you're going to square up to will be in the pattern. I'm going to move my fabric out of the way so I don't accidentally cut the strips that I have laid out here. Now my next step is going to be to add fabric number 2. Just like I did before, I'm going to do the sides and the top and the bottom. I've added the sides, so I'm going to press those out and away. Now I'm going to add the top and the bottom. Now that I've added that round of color, we're going to set it with our iron. Take a moment to square this up. And now the last step is going to be to add this background on. Just like we did before, we're going to do the left and the right and then the top and the bottom. Press this out, away from the center. Now we're going to put the top and the bottom on. Now that my final round of fabric is on the block, I'll give this whole thing a really good press. And then I'm going to square up the block. This should square to 9.5 inches. So this is what block 1 looks like. We start with our background, we have the background in the middle, and then we end with the background. Block 2 is going to be built out the same way, except we're going to start with fabric 1, and then we're going to build out background around it, just like we did with the other one, except we're putting the background there. So background fabric number 1 here, background fabric number 2 on the top and bottom. And then we're going to go to fabric number 2A on the left and right, 2B on the top and bottom. Then we're going to grab background number 3 for the left and the right, background number 4 for the top and the bottom, and then fabric number 3A for the left and right, and then 3B for the top and the bottom. And just like we did with the previous one, we're going to start sewing from the center and work our way out, and we're always going to press the seams out. Every time we add a lap, we're going to stop and trim to the same measurements that we did for the other block. The only thing different is we're shifting where the background is. In block number 1, the background is in the odd bands, 1, 3, and 5. And in block number 2, it's in the even bands, number 2 and number 4. I have some of my block 1 units made and some of my block 2 units made, and I just want to talk to you about how all of these are going to go together. This is a square quilt that is made of 7 rows of 7, so 49 blocks altogether. The beauty of this design is that you're going to alternate the blocks. You're never going to put block 1 next to block 1 or block 2 next to block 2. They're always going to be touching each other. So that means in rows 1, 3, 5, and 7, you're going to start with block 1, and then you'll go to block 2. You'll do 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. So you're going to start and end with block 1. In rows 2, 4, and 6, it's going to be the reverse. You're going to start with block 2 and then go to block 1. So you'll have 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, and then end with 2. You're always going to start and end with the block that you started with, so there's really no right way up. The moral of the story is you're going to need 4 rows of 7 that start with block 1 and end with block 1, and 3 rows of 7 that start with block 2 and end with block 2. And then all of those are going to come together nicely to make your quilt. Now, all of these inner rows don't really matter a little bit, but you are going to be nesting seams where the blocks come together. And there really shouldn't be a lot of bulk right in here because there's no seams that are coming into the corner. It's just the fabric. So what I plan to do is to build out all of my rows and then take the time to actually pin everything together. For the rows that start with block 1, I'm going to press in one direction, and the rows that start with block 2, I'm going to press in the opposite direction. That's going to allow this intersection right here to nest up really nicely. Now that your quilt center is all pieced together, it's time to add your borders. And this can be a little controversial, I'm learning. The way I add my borders is not what you're supposed to do. You guys know why I'm using the air quotes, right? Yeah, quilt police will make themselves known when I tell you how I put my borders on. I do not measure my quilt. I just grab some fabric and sew it on. How many of you out there are cringing right now? Yeah, it's okay. What I usually do is grab my border fabric. I just make sure that I have a length that is longer than the side of the quilt, and I just sew it on. I'm very delicate when I'm handling that fabric. I let the machine do all the work so that nothing's getting stretched or distorted. Once it's sewn on, I press it out away from the quilt, and then I use a straight edge to cut off any excess. In my experience, that has worked just fine for me. However, you could find that your quilt is not perfectly square, or if you are distorting the fabric and you're not pinning, you could have issues where you're maybe working in some extra fullness or whatever the case may be. And so the proper way to add the borders to your quilt is to measure. You're going to measure the 2 sides that you're going to add your borders to, add those borders, and then measure the other 2 sides, measure that, and add those borders. When you measure, you're going to want to go with the bigger of the 2 measurements. For example, when I measure my quilt, if the left side of my quilt is 63.5 inches and the right side is 63, I'm going to cut at 63.5 inches. I'm going to pin both of my borders starting at the center and then at the other ends, and then just distribute any unevenness or bulkiness or fullness along the entire length, working from the center to one end and then the center to the other end, and then we'll stitch that on. That will help make sure that your quilt is a little bit more square, and I'm told will help reduce any fullness you might be adding to the quilt, but I don't know about that. Again, I follow the controversial method of, I have some fabric, I'm going to sew it on. I will trim it after it's sewn. So I'm probably not the best person to tell you how to add borders. I did put those instructions though in my pattern just in case you want to make your quilt perfectly square. So hopefully that'll help you. But there's nothing wrong if you do it my way. So either way, you should be good. Thank you, friends, so much for watching this video. I did want to end with a quick update on Mom's quilt. She's not done with it. She still has a lot of work to do, but I did promise you a sneak peek at what her quilt's going to look like. So on the screen in front of you is an image of a mock-up of this quilt in her colorway. I think it's going to look amazing, and I can't wait to see it all done. Let me know in the comments down below whether you preferred my quilt with the black background or Mom's quilt with the cream background. And also, how do you add borders? Do you measure and add borders according to the size of your quilt, or do you just lob them on my way? Thank you, friends, so much for catching up with me. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye!